Hello, this is Waldemar Januszczak, art critic, producer and presenter of documentaries. Thanks for watching Perspective, YouTube's home for classical art.
I would never lose myself for the sake of beauty, except for a je ne sais quoi, which attains adventure.
C'est facile de commencer une toile.
Ah non, oh là là. Non. J'attends toujours très très longtemps.
Tu tournes autour.
Oui. Je mets le tableau au mur, puis je le regarde, je m'assois à côté de lui, je recule le moment où il faut que je m'y mette. Je fume. Choisis des couleurs. Je touche à des pinceaux. Et puis quelquefois, je ne fais rien. J'attends d'oser.
What drove me to make painting my life was firstly the need that I felt to paint. As a child, I was given colours, and I preferred to dip my brush in the inkwell. The story I'm told, I must have been 4 or 5, I was tracing some big black lines on white paper. Someone asked me, "What are you drawing, young Pierre?" And I replied, "Snow." And that seemed so extraordinary. Everyone laughed, of course, but everyone remembered it, and they told me about it later. The black wasn't there for its quality as blackness, but also for its powers of blackness. By contrast, it probably rendered the paper whiter, like snow.
Winter 1919, Rodez in Aveyron, southern central France. Rue Combarel, where Pierre Soulages was born, had austere administrative buildings along one side. The courthouse, prison, gendarmerie, hospital, psychiatric hospital. On the other, a row of craftsmen's shops. 2 worlds with little in common. The story of Pierre Soulages starts here on the site of the workshops, amidst the work of modest folk, observing how they handle their tools, and listening dreamily to the sounds rising up from the workshops.
There was everything. There was cloth and a tailor. And there were those who worked with wood, the joiner, the cabinet maker, the cooper, that's different again. And then there was a carpenter, who I used to admire, because the carpenter does the most fantastic things with 3 tools: the adze, the wagoner's axe, and the mortising axe. I saw all those artisans and I understood something. The artisan knows very well what he's going to make and how he's going to go about it. For me, it's the exact opposite. I don't know what I'm going to do, and I know roughly how I'm going to go about it, because I know there are loads of possibilities, but I really don't know which ones I'm going to use.
Armand Soulages, Pierre's father, was a coach builder. He died when his son was just 5. The young boy was raised by his mother and elder sister, who quickly recognized his artistic sensibilities. Don't confuse the land of my childhood with the memory I kept of it. The things I held dear, the vast deserted plateaus, the bare trees, the stones, the earth, the old wood, the rusting iron, all these coarse things surely left their stamp on me. I've always preferred them to pure and lifeless materials.
When I used to go into the countryside, I would paint the trees that I saw 2 kilometers away. In other words, that I could hardly see, which meant that I was inventing something that I could barely make out. Or to be more precise, I was copying something that I could barely make out, and in that respect, I was inventing.
In the school bus that took him to Conques, near Rodez, young Pierre had little idea of what was about to happen. The visit to the Abbey Church of Sainte-Foy de Conques, a masterpiece of 11th century Romanesque art, had a decisive impact. He was 13.
J'étais très impressionné par ce que j'ai vu, par l'architecture, par la sculpture, par l'art. Et je crois que ce jour-là, au fond de moi, j'ai décidé de m'occuper de ces choses-là en faisant toute ma vie.
I went to the School of Fine Arts to sit the entry exam. And, as luck would have it, we walked through a room where there was an exam for torsos. And I saw what the students at that school were doing. I was absolutely horrified. It was exactly the opposite of what I liked. But I didn't dare to leave. And when I found out that I'd been accepted, I never went back to that school. I immediately took the train to Rodez. Once I was free of my military obligations, that was after the defeat in 1940, I heard that the Montpellier Art School was authorized to train a drawing teacher. So I hurried down to Montpellier, and I arrived there on a terrible day. It was the 13th of February, 1941. I heard the shouts, people shouting, "On veut du pain," or "We want bread." I went down to see what was going on, and when I reached the crowd, I realized they weren't shouting "On veut du pain," but "Vive Pétain, long live Pétain." On the balcony of the prefecture of Montpellier, I saw Franco and Pétain appear. Franco in France, in Montpellier, shaking hands with Pétain. My world collapsed. I had not only been anti-Franco, an anti-fascist, and now this. I thought, what the hell am I doing in this city? I was so unhappy. I went out in the morning and I visited the Fabre Museum. And there I regained my footing. It was magnificent.
In the spring of 1941, at Montpellier School of Art, a young woman came and sat next to Pierre, who, as she said, was best at drawing. Her name was Colette. She still shares his life 76 years later.
I saw this small young woman come over to me. She was fragile and slender. Her eyes made a great impression, the way she looked at me. And then she sat down next to me. And one day I came across her outside the school telling 3 boys, "Picasso, are you crazy? That's Dago painting." What the hell is she saying about Dago painting? I went over to get her out of there and said, "Listen, miss, you will never manage to convince these 3 here. I'm off to the Fabre Museum. Would you like to accompany me?" "Yes." We left together, we went to the Fabre Museum, and we've been together ever since.
In 1942, 1 year after they met, the young lovers married, wearing black at midnight. When Germany invaded the Free Zone 2 weeks later, Soulages avoided forced labor by hiding on a wine estate. In 1946, Pierre and Colette arrived penniless in Paris, moving into a modest apartment in Courbevoie. They lived on what was sent to them. Pierre's mother would post them bread coupons. Colette's father sent them wine, which they would barter for meat. The lack of money often meant Soulages had to approach painting in original ways. He would use walnut stain, a cheap material that he had discovered being used by the artisans in his childhood. It was with Walnut Stain in 1947 that I was able to pull myself together and obey a sort of inner imperative. The truth is that I felt constrained by oils. I had worked with them before the war, and I knew the constraints they imposed. Out of impatience one day, in a fit of temper, armed with some stain and a decorator's brush, I attacked the paper.
The first major exhibition that took place was a big exhibition of French abstract art in Germany, and it was a German psychiatrist, a doctor, an art lover, who had come to France and who wanted to revive everything that had happened during the Nazi period. He chose 7 or 8 painters, including me, and he also used one of my black and white pictures for the exhibition's poster.
For me, Pierre Soulages is an extraordinary person. His intense art touches me very deeply. I have known Pierre and Colette Soulages for more than 20 years now, and they are very important people in my life. I'm fascinated by the way they live, their openness, their curiosity. Pierre is a little bit like a spiritual father for me, and I forged my conception of painting and art through dialogue with him and his works. Pierre Soulages and his French colleagues played a key role in the renewal of abstract art in Germany. At the same time, that exhibition was the start of Soulages' successful career as an artist, since it opened a great many doors for him. Dominic had asked the artist to write a few words of introduction to their work. Soulages wrote, "A painting is an organized whole, an ensemble of relationships between shapes, lines, colored surfaces on which are overlaid or not the meaning one gives to it." It was in this letter, written in 1948 for the exhibition French Abstract Painting, that Pierre Soulages, for the first time, formulated that phrase which his admirers know so well, and which constitutes his aesthetic manifesto. And we are naturally delighted to have found it here in its original manuscript form.
The German poster of the 1948 exhibition would open the door to the other side of the Atlantic for Soulages. Brought home by a young American and hung at the Artists Club in New York, it left a strong impression on many American expressionists and marked the start of his reputation there. Six years later, in 1954, Soulages was contacted by the celebrated New York gallery owner Samuel Coutts, who sold Picasso's works in the United States. This was an opportunity for the artist, who was not exhibited by his French dealer, Louis Carré. Coutts showed Soulages' work in his gallery every year until it closed in 1966. For a decade, the cream of American painters, such as Rothko, de Kooning, Motherwell, and Newman, all organized parties in his honor.
Here we are, Soulages in America. It's a very important subject because there's so many paintings by Pierre Soulages here in the US, in museums across the country. So most of the paintings that Soulages was making went to Coutts and were bought by Americans, in many cases by great American collectors, some big names from Hollywood, people like Otto Preminger, Charles Lawton, and so on. So what happened in some ways is very simple, which is that Sam Coutts closed his gallery. Soulages' last show with Coutts was in 1965. And he never really got another regular dealer in New York. And so without a foothold in New York, he did have a great show at the Museum of Fine Arts Houston in 1966. But without that presence in New York, it's very hard, especially when we think about what's happening also in New York with the rise of pop art, minimalism, whole new generations of younger artists. And so all these collectors had all this work by Soulages. Gradually, They begin to give it to American museums. And where does it go? Unfortunately, in many cases, it goes into the basement, into the storage of American museums. And so, as a result, really not until the 90s do we start to see dealers bringing him back, and museums taking him out of storage, which I'm doing, and I hope a lot of my colleagues also are doing.
Pierre and Colette, they're like high school children. They're like kids in high school. They're so kind of at ease with each other, and they're very young. They seem very young when they're together. And at the same time, they have a very deep conversation. You meet an artist couple sometimes. The man is the big person, and the artist's wife is the small person, and it gets a little uncomfortable. And with them, I never felt that. I remember I went to some show, and he and Colette were sitting on chairs next to each other. And it was just really like, it was sweet to watch them talking to people, but he was very he was a gentleman with her. In the word gentle and man, gentleman, he was really like a true gentleman with her. I was coming back to the United States, and my passport, the plastic over the photo had come off, and the security man, he says, "Why were you in Paris?" And I say, "I was here to interview Pierre Soulages." And he saluted me and said, and kind of bowed and let me through. And I thought, wow, he's a much bigger artist than I realized, because how many people at an airport as a security guard I never had that happen with an American security officer. It's not going to happen now. It's even worse. But that moment, I thought, oh, and then I realized how important he was to the French. And I thought, this is great that they would honor an artist so much. Americans should honor their artists as much as the French do. Saying a few words who Pierre Soulages is impossible. In a good way, because you can't put them in a little box, right? And I think if you can't put an artist in a little box, that's a challenge. That's telling you something right away. And I can't put him in a little box. And so that's one of the reasons I like him, because I feel like every time I've written about him, when I finish the essay, maybe a month later, I think, I could have said something else, or there's another thought that occurs to me, or what about this, or have I thought about it this way? And I think that he keeps making me, when I think about his work, he keeps making me ask questions. And I think that is really important to me as a person.
In 1958, the first book about Soulages was published, with 14 reproductions, reproduced as postcards. It was October 1958. It was a horrible period. The Algerian War was going on. De Gaulle had come to power, but the Algerian War intensified. It was terrible. People forget, but there were attacks every day on the streets of Paris. I was truly overwhelmed. I walked around bent double in sadness, depression, and I saw this reproduction, and it totally lifted me up again. So I bought this postcard, which I kept with me during the whole Algerian War. That was absolutely key to me, the idea that whatever political events were happening, there is something in great works of art that can intensify your life and give you infinite force. Right from his beginning, Soulages had above all worked on contrasts, on the juxtaposition of black and white, notably with the famous walnut stain on paper. There are big signs, signs with no meaning, but which are hieratic, enigmatic signs in the middle of the paper. And in this painting, you have the same use of contrast, except that the black is not only in opposition to white, but also to yellow, red, green, which it enhances, because it's true that the violence of black always enhances a painting. Then in 57-58, something new appeared, which was light through transparency. Is Soulages' second great light in the background.
Oui, alors ça, ce sont des outils que j'ai fabriqués, des lames de cuir. Je chargeais cette chose-là de noir, je déposais du noir ici, et puis avec une inclinaison de l'outil, comme ceci, je découvrais le bleu qui était dessous, et même le blanc qui était sous-jacent au bleu. Ce qui fait que dans la même trace peinte, j'obtiens une variété à la fois de couleurs, de valeurs, et d'une manière irremplaçable.
In 68, something totally new also appeared for 3 or 4 years. Canvases in black and white. Up until then, black and white had only been used on paper. Backgrounds were always colored, architectured. And now we had canvases in black and white, usually in landscape, in large formats. These canvases present a sort of lateral construction which would be developed. Big black downstrokes, sometimes swirls. In all the years that followed, up to 78, there would be paintings that blended a little of this genre. Downstrokes with colors. You no longer had white backgrounds. Then suddenly, one night in January 1979, everything changed. In a radical rupture in his painting, Pierre Soulages moved on to outre noir, beyond black.
Most of the things I've done are not things I meant to do from the start. They just appeared to me. Even that famous day, or night to be more exact, when I realized that I was painting light. It was like that. I was no longer painting in black. It wasn't the black that counted, it was the light being reflected by the black, not by another color, which drove me. And I realized right away. Beforehand, I had been moping around. I was upset because I was convincing myself that I was drowning, that I was messing up a painting. I felt like I was wallowing around in this kind of swamp, this black swamp. And then I realized that I had been working on it for hours. And I thought, what's going on? I must try and carry on with the painting in the way I thought I'd succeeded before. But there was something much stronger inside me, which meant that despite the failure, I continued to work on something yet more powerful, which drives me on. And I went to bed. An hour later, I came back, and I saw that I was doing another painting altogether. I was no longer working with black, I was working with the reflection of light on black. That was what I called black light, and which I then called outre noir.
From the beginning, monochrome black had been lying in wait. And on that January night, all of a sudden, he discovered that it's not just monochrome, that using a single pigment by painting in one color, you can embrace light, different lights, and any light. So much that black no longer appears as a color, but as the source of the light that is projected onto it. And by the very fact of this work using reflection, it happens that when you change point of view, for example, if you move in front of the canvas, the blacks and light areas shift. And it was this discovery that meant that, all of a sudden, deep down, it was this that he had always been waiting for, because he'd always been waiting for light to come from the dark. And then once he discovered this possibility, he stuck with it.
Il va y rester.
Ça, c'est du noir broyé à l'huile, avec une résine. Alors je peins évidemment avec ça, mais ce qui compte pour moi, c'est le reflet sur l'état de surface. Quand c'est lisse, comme ça, c'est une autre lumière que j'obtiens que lorsque je le passe avec ça. Quand il est comme ça, j'ai des stries qui se produisent, plus ou moins profondes, qui font vibrer la lumière. Et c'est là-dessus que se fonde ce que je fais. Mais enfin, tel que je l'exprime, là, c'est uniquement une question de lumière, comme, au fond, les impressionnistes pourraient en parler. Alors qu'il ne s'agit pas de ça. Il s'agit de ce qui se passe entre la toile et moi, et le champ mental qu'elle atteint avec les rapports du noir avec la lumière.
There's something very carnal about Soulages' painting. That's why I think it has a strong link with electronic music, electroacoustic music. There are preconceived ideas about the fact that electronic music may be cold or robotic, just as there is a preconceived idea that Soulages' painting can be cold and abstract. It's exactly the opposite. I'm from Lyon, in the east of France, so I'm very attached to gastronomy. In Lyon, we like to think we have some of the best cuisine in the world. In fact, we have a tactile, organic rapport with everything. And in a certain way, we can really relate to Soulages. The fact that he works with his hands. It's an approach which is, okay, it is intellectual, cerebral, but above all tactile. It's the approach of a chef. And from my point of view, electroacoustic music, the kind of music I make, it's chef's music, by which I mean I mix loops, bits, textures, waveforms in a very sensual and very organic way. And that's also one of the connections I've woven over time with the work of Soulages. So in a certain way, I think that his painting should be called concrete painting rather than abstract painting. My first exposure to Soulages' work, I must have been 14, and it was in the Museum of Modern Art in Paris. I think it was probably the first retrospective of his work, and it was one of the biggest shocks of my life, along with 2001, A Space Odyssey by Stanley Kubrick. I think those were the two founding moments of my artistic life, in the way of approaching sound and the way of approaching music. When you're creating something, there's that magical moment of loss of control, and I talked about that with Pierre Soulages. Ultimately, the key point in the creative process is that loss of control. And in the end, you can spend your whole life looking for that, because it's that loss of control which is linked to a preliminary labor or preparatory work, which can be laborious and can be painful, and which can also be long, but which will nonetheless enable that moment when everything comes together. That moment when the writer finally finds himself face to face with the characters who were eluding him. The musician finds the sounds that were eluding him, and the painter finds the subject that he was looking for. That's what I love about Soulages' work, that mix of absolute control with the accident that is always just around the corner, if I may put it like that.
It's through what I do that I find out what I'm looking for. To begin with, what I liked about rugby was that the ball is oval. It seems stupid, but it's crucial because that shape leads to the unexpected. And the unexpected is what I'm interested in. That's what interests me in painting every day. When I start out on a picture, I don't know what I'm going to do. There's an event which occurs while I'm painting which triggers the rest. It's a lot like rugby. In the very conception of that game, the unexpected bounce. That's how my paintings work.
Transformation réussie cette fois, toujours pour le stade.
It's through what I do that I find what I'm looking for. Scientists are always obliged to produce requests for financing in which they have to plan their research. And very often they are tempted at that point to do what is called incremental research, which basically means a slight variation on some existing work because they know it will work. The results are known in advance. It's through what I do that I find out what I'm looking for is exactly the opposite. It means you embark on something unknown, and which generally doesn't lead to anything. One is destined for failure. But that said, something good can come out of the process itself. What counts is the journey. I was very struck by that. It's something that continues to amaze me. The fact that the thing which is so important to him in painting is absolutely universal in the field of creativity. I met Pierre in December '86. I had just started my physics thesis, and I had this sideline, let's say, which consisted of ferrying groups of French farmers around Paris. And that year I had the idea of taking them to the Galerie de France, where there was an exhibition of Pierre's recent paintings. And since I felt somewhat helpless faced with these country types and paintings at the same time, paintings that I'd just seen for the first time once more, I had written a rather ridiculous letter to Pierre to ask him if he would receive us. My idea was that he'd come to the gallery to talk about the pictures. I got an immediate reply. He said he totally agreed with the project, but that he couldn't make it on that Saturday. He said Sunday in his studio was possible, though. So the next day, I arrived with 15 or so of these farmers who were quite dubious after the exhibition in the Rue Saint-Victor. And we spent 3 hours there that were absolutely unbelievable. Especially the first hour, during which he questioned them all individually. Where are you from? What crops do you grow? What livestock do you have? And so on. With a knowledge of the agricultural world that left me speechless. And after a while, it told me a great deal about him and where he'd come from. The high point was the last one, a woman who made wine in the Aude. And he listed all the varietals she might have. Mourvèdre, Cinsault, Carignan, Grenache. And for each one, she said, yes, of course. What about the whites? Then came another list, and she cut him off after a moment and said, we also try to plant some less well-known varietals which are coming back. And then he said, Rolle, perhaps? And she says, yes, that's right, Rolle. What was extraordinary was that none of these farmers ever asked him, how do you know all that? How come you know so much about us? None of them. They were on an equal footing with this man.
Pierre can put anyone at ease. The situation is always a bit tense when very important people visit the studio. But if I'm stressed about the kind of situation, he usually manages to calm me down. All right, so the canvas comes up to there, right?
Yes, we moved it along.
Okay, fine. You sure that's right?
Yeah.
Okay.
We moved it along to, Shall we do it once more? It's tight.
Wait, there, okay. Now that should be better. People often ask me, what does that involve, the role of assistant for someone like Pierre? I started working with him in 1983. I rang at the door on street level, and he said, come up, it's on the upstairs floor. The door was open, I walked in, I couldn't see anyone. He came in and said, this is a studio. We use the familiar 2 form of address.
So does that go underneath?
He asked me right away to stretch some canvases on frames, something I'd never done before. I found myself standing in front of this really big frame with this loose canvas that I had to fix and tension quite tightly and evenly. It was a challenge, but he told me what to do and I managed it. When you look at how this polyptych is put together from behind, you can already see a lot about the way Soulages works. Pierre will order a given format. If it's going to be an assemblage, he thinks it through in advance, for example, the total weight. And in this case, the wood he used was red cedar, which remains very straight and is much lighter than certain other types of wood. You can also see that there is a pattern which he drew on the back of each section. And that pattern means that even someone who doesn't know the work will know that this is the bottom of the panel. This is the second, the third, and so on. Can you lift it a bit?
Not too much.
A tiny bit.
Okay.
In 2014, the Soulages Museum was inaugurated in Rodez, the painter's native town. Having donated some 500 works and documents, Pierre and Colette supervised the hanging. I allowed the museum to bear my name on one condition, that it was open to other artists. I wanted a living space, not a mausoleum.
Le blanc? Oui, il est possible que le blanc en haut soit trop haut, parce que c'est aveugle. En tout cas, ça marchera. Voilà. Il faut mettre du blanc. D'accord. Donc,
In Soulages' work, you often think you see imperfections or accidents. Here, for example, on this one, it's as if there's a stain. That could be interpreted as a stain. And that bothered me when I used to visit the museum and look at the pictures. Until the day when Pierre Soulages showed me some paintings in his studio that he'd just finished. And he showed me one and said, "I think this one is too perfect." And it was then that I think I understood why he deliberately leaves on his canvases what one could interpret as imperfections. Because I think Soulages here, he proves it. Well, that's my interpretation. He shows us that he doesn't think he's God. He knows that only God is perfect, and that everything in this world is imperfect. That our lives are made up of accidents. I think he puts all that philosophical reflection into his painting on what life is, how it is made up of imperfection, and yet it is that imperfection which conveys the beauty and greatness of the man, the work, and of God, who alone is perfect. Let's look at another one. This one is even more glaring, if I may say so. Imagine a craftsman doing that. If it were me, the first thing I would do would be to remove that mark. Whereas I'm practically certain that Pierre Soulages, if he didn't put it there deliberately, he's quite happy it's there. I think that mark expresses the mystery of Soulages' work, the greatness of Soulages' work. I was born 25 kilometers away from here. When I was very young, I came to Conques with my parents. Then later, I used to come a lot in my teenage years, and as a young man. I used to come on a moped, then later by car. For me, it was a place of refuge, a place where I'd come to confide to the Lord about my life, my worries, my misfortunes. It was a place I'd come to hide in a way, to snuggle up the way you might snuggle in your mother's arms. And this place was precious to me. When the windows by Pierre Soulages arrived, he left me shattered to some extent, because he let the light in. I used to like this place because it was dark, hidden, obscure, although one could still see the grandeur, the magnificence of the architecture. I used to like that darkness, and the light that Soulages suddenly let in was like an aggression for me. I no longer recognized the church in Conques as I used to love it.
Conques, where history comes full circle. In 1987, Soulages was reunited with an architectural work which almost 60 years earlier made him aware of his destiny as an artist. After turning down many stained glass window projects, he had to accept this commission from the Ministry of Culture. But the project raised deep concerns. Some thought the windows would be covered in black. But Soulages is not the painter of black, but that of the light. And just as he has always created his own tools and techniques, he likes inventing his own materials. He succeeded in creating a new glass for the stained glass windows in the Abbey Church. After 7 years of research and almost 700 tests in the laboratory, the 104 windows were installed in 1994.
The bishop appointed me priest for the valley, so I often came to celebrate Mass here. And that was when I had the time to admire the windows, to see that as well as the light they provided, they allowed one to discover the architecture, the harmony of Soulages' lines with the architecture of the church. Those lines, when you take the time to look at them window by window, you see how they sing. They sing in harmony with all the curves of the church. And with time, I stopped and contemplated them, window by window. And I discovered that depending on the time of the day, or even the seasons, the stained glass windows revealed colors within them, blues, magnificent ochres, and of course, I was won over.
For me, a painting, like a poem, does not hide. It doesn't mean anything. It obviously expresses something. It even brings us a great deal. But one must not confuse mystery with secrecy. Nothing is hidden in a painting. Mystery and secrecy are two different worlds. Secrets can be decoded. One can even say that they are there to be revealed, whereas mystery remains intact. It's another world, another realm, that of poetry or art in general.
One evening in 1951 at the Capitol Theatre in Toulouse, the future philosopher Alain Badiou, still a teenager, slipped with his friends, as he often did, into the box reserved for his father, who was mayor of the city. He was struck by the set designed by Pierre Soulages. Much later, the painter would become one of his references.
Who can be more contemporary than the person who, ultimately, in a certain way ahead of everyone, realized that outre noir could be the totality of the world, the invention of light, the landscape? That is a radical invention, and is therefore totally contemporary. And within this contemporaneousness, the virtues of patience, of research, of calm, the fact that in a certain way he makes no claim that what he does is extravagant, adventurous, paradoxical, a rupture. No. On the contrary, everything in his work is about fulfillment, serenity, such that one might bestow upon him the classic virtues. That's why I would classify Pierre Soulages, including his welcoming and at the same time solid personality at once very present and unshakable. I think he is our great classical artist. All too often, we think of black as an interruption, as a negation. In other words, there's the light, there's daytime, then darkness falls, night falls over day. And I think what Soulages has in mind and is trying to create is an inversion of this relationship, reminding us that, after all, it's always the light which emerges from darkness, the light which is first. And he uses this to make historical comparisons. For example, In a certain way, in the dark cave of prehistoric times, they made the light of the images emerge. It wasn't the other way around. And then there's the case of birth. The first cry of the newborn is when it emerges from the maternal cavern, the dark cave of the mother. And one might also say that in Soulages' work, there is the idea of showing that black is maternal, that it is darkness which represents birth, not the light.
Friday, May 13th, 2009. Dear Mr. Soulages, I was astounded and overwhelmed by your exhibition at Beaubourg last year. I wanted to stay at a distance, but also to touch, to enter the painting, into the darkness and its light. I find your blacks fascinating, precisely because they make the light speak, that light without which we would not know where we come from, who we are, and no doubt where we are going. That there is a connection between the light of the universe and the light of the spirit is a permanent miracle. I think black symbolically takes us back to our origins. Before there was life, what was there? No one can remember. What's more, to quote Soulages himself, Pierre says, black came before light. And for us, black has yet another meaning, because the farther away one looks, the more one is looking back in time. Quite simply because light takes a certain time to reach us. Looking at a distant star means looking at a star as it was before. So you're always going back in time, and therefore going towards our origins, and seeing less and less well because obviously the stars are less and less luminous. Soulages uses a painting like a device, and the black which is on it is there to interact with his audience, and it's the audience who continue to create the work, to give it the meaning depending on what they perceive, the lighting, the environment, the way they look at it, the angle, etc. And we too, in a certain way, we use devices which are telescopes. And with that device, we can see a universe according to the way the protocol has been arranged. So it's a point of view. It's always slightly different, that universe. It depends on what exactly you want to look at. And that's what is interesting, that way of bringing in not only the work and the artist, but the work, the artist, the viewer, and bringing us in, the device, the astronomer, and the universe itself. When I met Pierre Soulages, I felt like I was looking at him as if I were at the foot of a mountain, not out of shyness or anything, but because he's a man who, well, you feel as if he's going to take you in his arms and pass on his energy to you. That's what I found astonishing. I don't mean his work, which has been talked about enough, and that's obviously a different thing. But for me, as a person, he's the eternal man.
Donc, donc la peinture de Soulages, elle n'est pas que noire alors?
Non, avec le reflet, ça. C'est comme s'il y avait de la lumière. Il a essayé de chercher la... C'est en fait au début c'est noir, après en fonction du temps, ça change un peu. C'est très sombre, après le soleil ça fait de la lumière. Et c'est ça avec la lumière. C'est ça avec la lumière.
Il est très attentif celui-là.
Ouais. Et cet après-midi, moi je rencontre le peintre là, celui qui a fait ça. Qu'est-ce que je lui dis de votre part alors?
Qu'il continue comme ça. Qu'il continue, qu'il n'arrête pas sa carrière.
Donc, vous faites un petit bisou à Pierre là.
I was in Sète, near the workshop on the terrace, looking out on a wide, empty horizon. The sun had become a black disk, blacker than the sky. Everyone was looking up, fascinated. A great silence fell. It was a grandiose cosmic spectacle. The masked sun was the black of before the light, before colors. That which I love for its gravity, its radicalness. It was like the origin of the world, our origins too, before being born, before seeing the light of day. Is it because of all these reasons, buried deep inside us,
that since the very beginnings of painting, mankind, for hundreds of centuries, went to the darkest places on Earth, in the total blackness of caves, to paint with black?